Hello, my name is Dr. Susan Robbins, and the class is Comparative Human Behavior Theory. Say hello to the future viewing audience, class.
Hello.
Okay. Today we're going to continue our lectures, and we're going to be talking about Sigmund Freud. I have my little Freud bobblehead here. And I want to thank my friend Eddie Karen Lorenzo in New York, who gave me this little Freud bobblehead. I'm sure he's going to be watching me on YouTube to listen for this thank you. We're going to be talking about Freudian-based theory. And ordinarily, years ago, let me start with this. Years ago, as Freudian theory was on the wane. Why was it on the wane? It had fallen out of favor, essentially. Throughout, we've got to keep this in historical perspective. And I know I talked about this probably the very first lecture, that very early on, social workers, not just psychiatrists and not just psychologists, but very early on, social workers adopted Freudian theory. And from Freudian theory to Neo-Freudian theory, and that was essentially the primary theory base that accounted for most human behavior, Freudian and Neo-Freudian theory, through most of the 50s, 60s, and even up to the 70s. It really wasn't until the late 70s and early 80s that social work, quote-unquote, discovered systems theory. So the Freudian paradigm has been around for a very long time. It's an enduring paradigm. And as we started to move away from strictly Freudian theory and then moved more towards Ericksonian ego-based theory, Freud and Freud's thinking pretty much went by the wayside in social work. However, as we're going to see next week when we talk about Erikson, Erikson's theory is also inculcated with Freudian thought. And as you'll find in your readings, that we have people who wrote after Freud being either reformulators, in other words, they started with the basic premises that he did and then reformulated his theory, or people who totally revisionists who revised his theory entirely. So in order to understand the revisionists and the reformulators, it's important to understand the basis of what he was saying. Now, when I said I thought that Freud was dead, I mean, yes, he was physically dead, obviously, but I thought that Freudian thought had all but died out in social work. And then roughly in the 1980s, early 90s, Freudian theory reared its head again. And we're going to be talking about that and talking about the controversy. But before we get to the controversy, we're going to talk about today the basis of Freudian theory. What was he really saying? And most of us know the basic concepts of the id, the ego, the superego. We know his developmental stages. But very few people have gone back and read the original or first interpretations of Freud. Most people, when they read Freud, they do not go back to the why do I say interpretations? Translations, because he didn't write in English. So most people who are reading about Freud in their psychology textbooks read what I'm going to call digestible versions of Freud. And it's not necessarily what Freud was actually saying. So I think it's important to understand the logic of his theory for us to understand how all of these reformulators and revisionists came to what they came to write about what they thought. So to the first PowerPoint, we're going to be talking about Dr. Sigmund Freud. Okay, back over to me. When we talk about Freudian theory, it's important to also put this in a historical context. Every theory that we look at, we've got to look at not only the theory, but we've got to take a look somewhat at the life of the person writing the theory. Because if you remember what I said during the first class, theories are an extension of several things. They're an extension of the theorist, him or herself. It's also an extension of the historical time period in which they lived. Again, theories are time-specific, social science theories. That's because theorists live in certain kinds of environments, political, social, economic environments, that play a very large role in their thinking. And it's their thinking that brings us to theories. Does that make sense to y'all? Okay. So again, theories are part and parcel of the theorist, him or herself, as well as being bound to a particular historical time frame. And with that goes all of the socio-political environment that is present at the time that the person is writing. So Freud, he started off as a neurologist. Not a psychiatrist, not a psychoanalyst. And he was in private medical practice in Vienna. And what steered him to look at how people functioned was that he was seeing people who would come to him with neurological symptoms, and yet he could not find a physical basis for their illness. Again, people who would come to him with neurological symptoms, such as paralysis. And yet he would look at them physically as a neurologist and could not find a basis for the paralysis. Another example, they would come with blurred vision. Simply could not find a physical basis for it. So in his inquiry, he was trying to figure out what causes these clearly physical symptoms that do not have a physiological basis, which is an important question for a neurologist to be asking, right? And he started by learning about a man named Socw at the time, who was working with hypnosis. What would happen is that he would put these people, typically women, but not always, typically women, under a hypnotic spell, and the symptoms, the paralysis, the blurred vision, would simply disappear. And in fact, some of them, even after they woke up from the hypnotic trance, had lost the symptoms entirely. So that led Freud to think, it's not in their body, it's in their mind, right? So what Freud did is he studied hypnosis. He went to Paris, and in 1885 and 1886, he studied hypnosis. And what he was asking about was similarities between his cases and the patients that he was seeing and the cases that he saw Socw miraculously, quote-unquote, cure or at least alleviate temporary symptoms. And what Freud did is that he devised his psychoanalytic theory. Specifically, he was trying to explain the mind-body relationship. Does this all make sense now? Trying to explain the mind-body relationship. In other words, how could the mind create symptoms that were clearly physical in nature or appear to be, but yet the symptoms weren't coming from any kind of illness? They weren't coming from any kind of physical illness, medical illness. They weren't coming from any kind of injury. They were coming from the mind. So that's a starting point. And that will also help us understand why he believed so thoroughly in hypnosis. Very early in his theory, back to the PowerPoint, Freud proposed that there were 3 levels of consciousness. Remember, this is a theory of mind, so now he's no longer looking at the body, and he's talking about what are the levels of consciousness and how do they affect physiological functioning. Let's start with the unconscious. The unconscious is that region of the mind that holds thoughts and memories that we simply cannot access. Unconscious means that it is not in our conscious awareness and will always stay not in our conscious awareness. Again, we cannot access and we also cannot bring it into our conscious awareness. Now, let's take a look at this analytically. Is there such a thing called the unconscious? Do we know that there are unconscious processes, folks? Yes or no? Where do we see them? How do we see them?
Dreams.
Okay, certainly, when we're dreaming, we are not awake. And in fact, dreaming became analyzing dreams became a very significant part of Freud's theory. So clearly we know that we have some unconscious processes that occur without our awareness. And where do they come out? In our dreams, and if we happen to be in the right REM state when we wake up, we might or might not remember those dreams or parts of those dreams. However, and here's the important part of Freud's theory, he said that even though we cannot access these thoughts, these emotions, these feelings, these memories, they still affect our conscious functioning. Let me repeat that. Even though these thoughts, these memories, these feelings that are in our unconscious, that we cannot access during our waking moments, they are there, but they not only affect us unconsciously, but here's the leap, that they affect our conscious being as well. But we are unaware of them. They affect our behavior. We're unaware of them, but they affect our behavior. And therefore, in Freud's theory, he said that much of what we do as humans is based on what he called unconscious motivation. By the way, unconsciousness was not a new idea. Other philosophers had proposed this long ahead of Freud. And what the difference is that Freud elaborated on it, and he made take a very central role in our functioning. Do you all understand this? Again, other people had talked about the unconscious. The unconscious was not a new concept. What was new in Freud's theory is that the unconscious plays a central role in the way we function on a day-to-day basis. The next level of consciousness that he talked about, and I'm going to draw you a diagram of this, is what he called the preconscious. The preconscious holds the ideas and the thoughts and the memories that we are not currently thinking. So these are thoughts, ideas, memories, feelings that we are not conscious of at the moment, but we can bring it into consciousness. In contrast to the deep, deep, dark unconscious, where we cannot bring it into consciousness just by willing it so. Now following that? And I'm going to draw what this looks like. Clearly, the conscious part of the mind is the aware part of the mind. The aware part of the mind. Okay, so over to the tablet, please. This is my not so accurate and probably very poorly drawn drawing of this. Roughly, let's try black or blue. Okay, what did I do wrong? Something, obviously. So if we start off with something called the deep unconscious, and we're going to attach a structure to it, and you've got to understand that all of these are theoretical and philosophical concepts. There is no structure in the brain that we can point to that we call the unconscious. Is everybody clear about that? So as part of our functioning, we have a deep unconscious, and these are the thoughts, the feelings, the memories that we simply cannot access. And we're going to talk about how that grows throughout the lifetime. Any questions about the deep unconscious? Okay, back to the PowerPoint. Very important to Freud's theory is the role of instincts. The role of instincts. These, according to Freud, were inborn factors that give force and give direction to all of our psychological activity. So Freudian theory is based on what we call basic instincts, not the movie, but the theory. And in Freud's formulation, there are two basic instincts that drive our psychological functioning. And those are essentially the life instinct, which he attributed to be libido or sex. And later in his writings, he came to discover something called the death instinct, which he saw as aggression. So let's take a look at this logically, folks. What he's saying then is that what's steering us is sex, aggression, aggression, aggression. That these things are innate. They are there when infants are born. Sex and aggression, and those are the things that really steer our psychological development. So let me stop for a moment. What do you think about that? What are your thoughts about that? Does it make sense? Yes, no? Lorena, you're saying no. Why not? You have to use the mic.
I don't think it's just that simple.
Okay, so you think that it's a little bit more complex than that.
A little more complex than that.
Why would people find this appealing? Folks, let's look at this realistically. The Freudian paradigm, the Freudian model, the Freudian theory, and Freudian thought is so much a part of our culture. So much a part of our culture. It came to be so incredibly accepted by people in mainstream psychiatry, people in mainstream psychology. What would be so appealing about that? Leah, you had your hand up.
I think it's because it takes a more pessimistic view of human nature and kind of gives people an excuse that we're expected to satisfy our biological drives.
Okay, you say pessimistic. What do you see about pessimistic about it?
Well, it paints human nature as very one-dimensional, and there's that biological component that, yes, we have to procreate and reproduce and not let ourselves get killed, but there's more to us than that.
Okay, Jean, you had your head up. You have to use the mic. Mic. Thanks.
Also, being that it was Victorian times, very repressed, this gave a different view. We didn't have to be so repressed. We could
talk about sex.
Exactly.
We could talk about sex. You've got to put it in cultural context. Coming out of the Victorian era, sex was something that people didn't talk about. We still don't, but, well, we are consumed with ideas about sex, but we don't talk about it, right? But people then didn't talk about it at all, and therefore the idea that people could be sexual beings was somewhat enlightening, particularly to the more liberal thinkers of the day. So it had very instant appeal. And it caught on first in Europe and then certainly over here. And it became mainstream in what we do in social work. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. Okay, along with these basic instincts, he proposed that we have a basic personality structure. Basic personality structure. Okay. I'm going through my notes real quickly. Let's talk about the id first. Let's start with this. It's a theoretical structure. It's not a real physical structure. Everybody clear about that? So when I say, show me your id, can you do that? No, you can't, because it doesn't, again, none of this theory corresponds to anything specific in the brain, even though currently there are some people doing neurological research who are trying to tie it to that. But Freud, even though he was a neurologist, he was not talking about any neurological structures of the brain. Rather, he's talking about something called the mind, which is a theoretical construct. If I ask you, where is your mind? Where is it? Where do all of us point to immediately? Our brain, right? Other cultures, when you say, where is your mind, they will point to the heart, they will point to other parts of the body. But in Western culture, we associate the mind with the brain physiological functioning. And yet there is no structure in the brain called the mind. Is everybody clear about it? It's a theoretical structure. Okay, back to the id. PowerPoint for a minute. Very importantly, the id corresponds to the unconscious. So the id is a totally unconscious part of the self. And what is the id comprised of? Those basic drives, which are what? Everybody, use the mics.
Sex
and aggression.
Sex and aggression. Basic drives are what he called instinctual energies. Sex and aggression. Okay, so let's talk about the id for a second. Back to me. In Freudian theory, the unconscious level, the id contains everything that we bring into this world at birth. And therefore, libidinal energy, remember sex is one of the driving forces, assumes the form of needs. People have these instinctual urges, these sexual, aggressive, instinctual urges coming from the id, and these have to be fulfilled in one way or another. These needs have to be fulfilled. And therefore, in Freudian thought, when you release libido, you release that sexual energy, it is experienced as, in Freud's terminology, pleasure. Well, think about this. Here's this infant with all of these libidinal instincts that have to be expressed. And once they are expressed in one way or another, the release of all of this tension and pressure in the id gives the person pleasure. That makes sense? Not does it make sense in the real world, does it make sense in terms of theory? Yes? Okay. Conversely, when you block the ability to release libidinal energy, what is it experienced as?
Frustration.
Frustration as pain. Pleasure and pain. So let's think about an infant. And essentially, these are all theories about what is going on in the infant's mind. Therefore, what Freud said is that the id operates on something called the pleasure principle. And what is the pleasure principle? Give me pleasure. And what do I want to avoid? No pain. Keep the pain away. According to Freud, the newborn is primarily id. Primarily id. And therefore, what the newborn is trying to do is satisfy these libidinal urges and satisfy the needs. According to Freud, the newborn's awareness of the external world was very, very fuzzy. Very, very fuzzy. Mostly what's steering infants is, give me pleasure, give me pleasure, give me pleasure. Right? Very importantly, in Freudian theory, the infant cannot distinguish self from other. And this becomes a real cornerstone of not only Freudian theory, but all other varieties of Freudian theory. Okay, because the infant can't distinguish the self from the other, the infant is only aware of two things in this formulation: pleasure and pain. Okay, as the infant grows and starts to experience more of the external world, awareness begins to develop. Awareness begins to develop. Essentially, here's what Freud's model said, and this is in some of his later writings. What he was saying essentially is that we are born with these instinctual urges, and the two instinctual urges are sex and aggression. And if that is our normal state of being, because that's what we are born with, then it takes society a lot of work to socialize those instincts out of us. Does that make sense? Again, if the normal state of the human infant is sex and aggression, and that's how they get their needs met, then it takes a lot of societal intervention and socialization to socialize those instincts into something that makes us a social being. So in Freud's formulation, there was always this tension between society that had rules and norms for conformity and this needy id that wanted to get its needs met. Does that help you a little bit to understand the basis from which he's coming? Okay. Part of what goes on with the infant, according to Freud, is something called primary process. I don't have a PowerPoint for this, so just listen to what it is. It's the earliest level of awareness results in what he called a primary process. This is real critical to his theory. Primary process is the infant's act of creating in its memory the image of an object that's going to give it pleasure. Let me repeat that. One of the primary things that goes on in infancy, according to Freud, in primary process, is that because the baby is always seeking pleasure, 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 yes? And what the infant must do is create in its memory the image of some external object that's going to give it pleasure, because it cannot get pleasure on its own. Well, think about this. The child needs to eat. The infant has no access to food, and therefore, whatever object gives it pleasure, it's going to create memories of. That make sense? So let's say the child is hungry. What happens when infants get hungry? What do? They cry. What do mothers do in response to their children crying? They feed them, either breastfeed them. Certainly in Freud's time it was breastfeeding, or now we give them formula. Okay, in Freudian theory, once the child has been fed, the tension of hunger is gone, and the child experiences what? Okay, you got it. What he says is that the repeated cycles of the infant having his or her needs met and getting pleasure, what the infant starts to do is to store images in the mind about how they can get satisfaction. So now at this point in Freud's theory, the infant can now imagine those things that are going to bring pleasure. And in this case, in the very early stages, what is it has it been historically? Mother's breast, right? Okay, very importantly, primary process, because it's all id-driven, is irrational, it's chaotic. It doesn't distinguish between reasonable demands and unreasonable demands. All that the infant is saying to himself or herself is, gimme, 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 right? Whether or not mommy is available at that moment is irrelevant, because the child still has these instinctual urges. So it's irrational because the child is experiencing these urges, and yet the environment at that time might not be able to meet these urges. Very importantly, the primary urge of the id, the primary concern, is to gain satisfaction regardless of whether or not the method of satisfaction is practical or even available in the environment. Again, let's think about the id urges. Give me, give me, give me, give me. Mom might not be there, but yet the urges are still there. Okay, so what the personality needs next, think about this, because this is the first part of personality, this id that is saying, give me, give me, give me, I want pleasure. I don't want pain. And if those id impulses aren't satisfied, what does he maybe experience?
Pain.
Pain. Everybody, come on. You got to keep me awake today. Okay, so the next thing that has to develop in the personality structure is a component that recognizes the nature of the environment. Because so far, it's just primary id urges. Okay, back over to the PowerPoint. So the next structure that emerges, this is the second component of what he called the psychic apparatus, is the ego. Again, it's a theoretical structure. If I say, show me your ego, can you tell me where it is? No, because there isn't a physical thing that corresponds to ego. This is the next part of personality that includes both the conscious and the preconscious. And it develops out of the id. I'm going to draw this for you so you can see this. It's not a separate structure. It actually develops out of the id's urges, that's hard to say, as a response to the environment. And it helps children distinguish self from other. Because early on, according to Freud, the world is very fuzzy to infants, and they cannot tell the difference between them and their mother's breast. Okay, back over to me. Unlike the id, which works on which principle? The id works on which principle, everybody?
Pleasure.
Pleasure principle. Gimme, 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 right? Give me pleasure, keep me out of pain. The ego, on the other hand, works on what he called the reality principle. What the reality principle does is that it reorganizes the conditions and demands of the real, it recognizes the conditions and the demands of the real world. So here's this id that's not able to do this, but here's the next part of personality structure that says, okay, mom's not here, I'm going to have to wait. And essentially what the id ends up doing is playing the role of the negotiator in between the reality of the environment and the id's demands, which may be unreasonable for the moment. The ego has to turn this primary process images, those images that are stored in the brain, into reality. And therefore, this problem-solving act of the ego is what he called the secondary process. The reality principle is tied to the secondary process. It's the way that the child solves the problem. So there's that unsocialized id saying, feed me, feed me, feed me, hunger, hunger, hunger. Until the ego develops, the child is going to be frustrated and feel pain. Once we have a developing ego, the ego might say, okay, mom's not here. You're going to have to wait. You're going to have to wait. You're following that? So there's now a part of personality structure that helps mediate the real environment with these id urges. In this secondary process, according to Freud, the individuals develop skills in perceiving, in remembering, and analyzing and taking direct action. Again, the secondary process is unlike the primary process, which is chaotic, right? This is a very organized process in which the child begins to perceive, remember, analyze, and start to take action. Okay, so let's stop for a minute and take a look at this. In addition to what's going on supposedly intrapsychically inside the mind, what else in reality is going on with infants at this stage biologically? Folks, what happens to infants biologically? Do they stay little tiny infants?
They grow.
They grow. So what's happening? We're having maturation of all of the bodily, all of the perceptual organs, the eyes, the ears, the nose, right? You know, infants have very blurry vision when they're first born, and as the eyes mature, they begin to see more clearly. Hearing changes, the sense of touch, everything changes as the child begins to grow. So essentially what's happening with the ego is that it grows from the id's needs, from the maturing bodily organs, and, very importantly, the id's increasing awareness of the world. The id's increasing awareness of the world. Now, Freud did not tie this to specific brain processes, because remember, he was talking about this theoretical structure of the mind. But one of the things that we now know from cognitive science is that as infants grow and develop, neurologically what's taking place in the brain is that new neurological connections are constantly being made. Tremendous growth spurts, which is why we see all of a sudden the children physiologically and biologically maturing, being able to do cognitive things differently at different stages of development, specifically because of the neurological connections that are constantly growing in the brain. Any questions about that? Okay, let's go back to the tablet now for a minute. Move this over here, and I'm going to draw what the development of the ego, the id, and the superego look like in this theory. So roughly, this is a child at 1 month. Okay? And this is the id. So at 1 month, the child is primarily id, primarily primary process. As the child starts to grow and develop, what we then see, and do you remember what we said about the id? Is the id conscious or unconscious? Everybody?
Unconscious.
There is no conscious element of the id. The id is totally unconscious. You all following this? So this is what we call the deep unconscious. Freud's unconscious. And what's going on there? What's going on in the unconscious?
Pleasure and feeling.
Everybody. Instincts for pleasure. Avoid pain, give me pleasure, right? Okay, as the child grows, here we have the beginning of the, now this is hard to do over here. Let's try this again. Make this a little bit bigger. We have the beginning of an ego. Can you all read that? That says ego. So this is roughly, in Freud's formulation, what the id and the ego look like at 1 month. So what can we say? That the child is primarily what? Everybody. Primarily id, with just a very beginning developing ego. Okay, so now we're going to see if I can scroll down here to the next page. This is always a challenge to me. Here we go. We're going to take a look now at a child at roughly 3 years. I really want you to see the difference in the way these structures develop. See here, that was 1 month. Here we have the child at 3 years. At 3 years, we have more of an ego development, but we still do not have the next structure. So here we have, I'm going to introduce you another concept as well. Again, this is a very badly drawn representation of this. Here we have the id. Here we now have a much bigger ego. You following that? Now there's something else that goes on, and that's something called repressions. Anybody know what happens when we repress things? Oh, come on, folks. The concept, back over to me. The concept of repression is so much a part of our society. Of all the Freudian terminology, and there's much of it that gets into our everyday language, isn't repression part of that? What happens when people repress things? Any ideas?
Might become depressed.
Sorry?
Might become depressed. Might experience depression or...
They might show their behavior as repression, as depression, but something more basic happens. Has anybody read the chapter?
Yes.
Okay.
Denial, we don't accept, we keep it in the unconscious. It doesn't come out to our conscious level.
Repression, according to Freud, was an unconscious process. Let's go back to his basic theory. Here is the id seeking pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Before the ego develops, what happens? Pleasure isn't always available, and the baby experiences that as traumatic, as pain. So what does the baby do with this pain? The infants repress memories of things that are uncomfortable. And what does that mean? That they take this negative event and push it down into the deep unconscious so that they don't have to deal with it on a conscious level. You following this? Repression is a very, very big part of this theory, because what he is saying essentially is, let's go back to the basics. The id is what? Pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Is the pleasure always there? So how does the child handle this? According to Freud, there's this mechanism by which the infant then represses all of the unmet needs of things that are too traumatic, too uncomfortable. So therefore, go back to the drawing. By the time the child is 3 years old, we have lots of repressions. And all of this takes place where? In the unconscious id. You all following that? So therefore, do you see how the ego grows out of the id? It's not a separate structure. I know that this sounds like silly stuff. Why do we need to know this? Because those who reformulated Freud and got into a lot of trouble doing so, because Freud then became their enemy rather than their friend in some cases, decided that this model was not correct. And it's all about these theoretical structures that don't really exist in the real world, but things that people strongly believed in. So again, do you understand why Freud said that the ego grows out of the id? Because it's in response to the id's needs that are not being met. You're following that? Yes. Okay. And therefore, before a child has a good and healthy ego, because this child is still growing and the ego grows, according to Freud, as the child gets older. So if you start with a very immature ego that cannot deal with the conflictual demands of the id and the reality of society, what happens is that the child then represses those memories. Does that make sense in terms of the theory, not in terms of real life? Yes? Okay. So here's where we have the ego, and we have the thought process. Conscious thought processes that take place with the awareness of the ego. Are there thought processes, let's turn over to me now, are there thought processes taking place in the unconscious or not? Yes, but they're not conscious. You all following this? The infant still has drives and needs. They are now repressed, so those thoughts that are repressed, any kind of frustrations are repressed into the id. So it's not a conscious thought process, but there are still thoughts going on there that we're not aware of. Instincts going on there as well. Y'all following this? Is this helping you understand Freudian thought a little bit better? Okay. Okay, next structure, back to the PowerPoint. The next structure to develop is what he called the superego. The superego has essentially two components. The superego, the part that we call conscience, what is its function? It punishes the child with feelings of guilt or shame when internalized values are not followed. So essentially, the superego is a socialization. It's the way in which the child incorporates all the norms, not only of mom and dad, but the norms of society. And again, this is a process that goes on internally in the mind. And children who have a very well-developed superego, when they do something wrong, what do they feel? Shame and guilt. On the other hand, here's the flip side of this. The superego also rewards the child with pride and self-praise when those internalized values are followed, which he called the ego ideal. So let's analyze this for a second. This is really important. Back over to me again. Essentially what Freud was saying is that as we get older, roughly 5 or 6 years old, up until age 5 or 6, we are primarily id. What grows out of that? We get a stronger and and stronger ego, more ego as we grow and have more experience with the world. At this point, the ego is playing a very large role in mediating reality and the id's needs. However, there's a third component that is necessary, and that is the socialization, the ability of the child not to be functioning only on negotiating reality and the id's needs, but the ability of the child to internalize the core values of his or her society, of his or her family. And this develops with a structure that he called the superego. We're going to talk in great detail about this superego. I'm going to draw it for you first, though. So back to the tablet. If I can get this to move. What the viewing audience is not seeing is that I'm struggling with the stylus because I'm left-handed. And this is a right-hand, all tablets are right-handed. Okay, we're going to see a very different picture now emerge, and then I'm going to talk about the processes that Freud said took place to develop the superego. Let me stop. Are there any questions? Any questions first? I'm being as clear as mud? No questions at all before I go on? Because it gets really complex from here. It gets really complex from here. Okay, back to the tablet. Okay, so by age 12, children start to develop a superego in Freud's theory roughly at age 5 or 6. And this is age 12. This is what this would look like. Oh, by the way, anytime you see this little thing on top, this is consciousness. Even in adults, that would represent, in other words, what Freud was saying is that the majority of our lives are spent with unconscious processes. So that's the conscious aspect of self. So what do we have here now? We have the id that we started with, right? I'm drawing these lines just to differentiate the two. Here we have the ego. Look at how big it's gotten. Yes? Here we have, now by age 12, does the child have many more repressions? Absolutely, because the child has experienced adverse things in the environment, things that the id sees as adverse. So what do we have here now? We have significantly more repressions. But now we have a new structure. I'll find a different color here. Called the superego. Do you see how this superego is not part of the conscious process? Because where's consciousness? Consciousness is right here, right? This is consciousness right here. So the superego, in essence, is still part of the unconscious process, but it crosses the id and the ego. You all following this? So this is the superego. I'm just going to put SE for superego. And what do we have in the conscious part of the self? We have all the values. We have the rules, because we're conscious of those, aren't we, by age 6, by age 12? Let's think about that for a second, folks. Okay, away from this and over to me. Let me give you a real concrete example. Have any of you ever tried playing a board game with a 3 or 4-year-old? Yes, what happens? Use your mics and tell me what happens. Yeah. Shakira.
They cheat and they change the rules all the time.
Okay, by our standards, they quote-unquote cheat. They change the rules because they have not internalized rules to follow. You say, this is the way the pieces jump on the board, and they don't care. They'll just jump the pieces any way they please. And that's because they do not have a superego to constrain them. You're following this? What happens, how many of you have played board games with children who are 6 or older? Roughly at age 6, what kind of change do you see? Anybody?
They're very focused on being fair, or things being fair.
More so than fair. Anybody else have a clue?
I think they want to win. They're competitive.
Okay, what else? More important change. A rule is a rule is a rule, and you cannot break the rules. And you sit down and say, oh, but the rules are... No, they're not. But what I'm trying to get at is that, in this sense, Freud really was right. Roughly at age 5 or 6, and again, he was basing this on observation of children, more so observation of clients. Roughly what does happen to children roughly at age 5 or 6, now he calls it a superego, we're going to find other theorists calling it something else. What he's saying is that finally the children are able to internalize the rules, internalize the norms, internalize the expectations of society, so that whereby, as Shakira pointed out, a child cheats. They don't know it's cheating, they're just making up their own rules because they have not yet internalized what is right, what is wrong. By age 5 or 6, they have so totally internalized it that you cannot steer from the rules in a board game. Because the child says, we have to follow the rules, there's no flexibility. Now that changes hopefully as children get older, but by age 5 or 6, what that's showing us is that they really have internalized the rights and the wrongs. And what are the two processes of the superego that we talked about? Everybody.
Socialization.
The two processes that go on. The ego ideal and conscious. Children gain a sense of conscience. Children gain a sense of conscience, and therefore they have to follow what is right to avoid feeling bad. You're following that? And was Freud right about the age at which this happens? Yeah. Absolutely, he was dead on. Again, other people have talked about the same thing, and we'll talk about other theorists, and simply called it something else. And the difference is that other theorists do not say that the conscience develops out of a necessity to the id's greedy urges. Again, that's what Freud brings uniquely to this. Any questions so far? Okay, back to this for 1 second, to the tablet. So we can see from this, and again, you're going to laugh at how important this becomes, that Freud said that the ego grows out of the id and the superego develops in response to both the ego and the id, so it's still an unconscious process. What the conscious part of the superego is up here, where we can see that children understand the rules, that they understand the norms. You're following that? Okay. Back over to me for a minute. Very importantly, part of Freud's theory is that he said that children are born amoral. Not immoral, but amoral. In other words, children simply do not know good from bad. They're not born tabula rasa because they are born with what? This id with all of the urges, the id with all of the instincts, right? But children are not born bad. They're not born good. They are born amoral, according to Freud. In early stages, morality for children is simply getting pleasure and avoiding punishment. Very importantly, a young child, infants, young children before the age of 6, do not feel bad if they don't follow the rules. As we can see from board games, they think cheating is fine. And typically what happens with parents, they're the ones who manipulate the rewards and punishments for the children, right? Very importantly in Freud's theory about the superego is that even though children are not born moral, they have the capacity to internalize moral values. Again, the capacity to internalize moral values and feel good when they're following them and feel bad when they're not. So in Freud's theory, just as the ego develops out of the id, the superego develops out of the ego. You're following that? Yes? Any questions about that? Now, you saw as I drew it, that part of it is unconscious, part of our superego is unconscious, and part of it is conscious. Questions? Everybody understand that much? Yeah.
Why is it that the superego develops out of the needs of the ego? Because the ego is already mediating the instinctual and kind of keeping that. So why would we need...
If the ego had to do that all the time, it would have a very, very tough job. And therefore, for a person, once the ego is developed, we have not internalized the rules of society. So if we didn't have this new structure called the superego, the ego would have to work overtime negotiating reality with the id's urges all the time. And therefore, again, part of this is based on observations of people, that people do not stay id processes, they do not stay with having an ego having to mediate that. Instead, something called the superego helps us manage our needs and therefore punishes us when we're not following what's expected and makes us feel good when we are. It's just one more stage of development. Any other questions? None? I'm being that clear. I just love that. Okay, now we're going to turn to the stages, the actual stages of development. We already talked about this. Repression, it's an unconscious ego defense. It's an unconscious ego defense. And what happens when people repress things, and again, this is a significant part of Freud's theory and a very significant part of the controversy that followed Freud. Unpleasant experiences are pushed down into the deep unconscious. Very importantly, this is not a conscious process. It's not like I had a trauma and I'm aware of it and I don't want to think about it and I try something consciously to get rid of it. In this formulation, Freud's formulation, the minute that the id is having difficulty because its needs are not being met and there's an unpleasant experience that's thwarting its ability to get pleasure, what happens is that unconsciously we repress or push these experiences down into our deep unconscious. That's a really important part of this theory because what Freud said is that most pathology in adult life is a result of what? Repressions. And therefore we have a lot of pathology that come out of these repressions that we're simply not aware of. And yet, according to Freud, they affect our behavior as adults. They affect our behavior in the here and now, even though we are not consciously aware of them. And therefore, one of the aims of Freudian-based therapy is to get all of these repressed ideas out in the open where we can then deal with them. And hopefully we will change our behavior. Now, whether or not that happens is another issue entirely. Okay, let's take a look at Freud's stages of development. Does everybody understand the underlying psychic mechanisms before we go into the actual stages? Okay, what I've described for you so far are the actual psychic mechanisms or psychological mechanisms. Again, these are not structures that are tied to the brain development, but rather this theoretical concept of what goes on in the quote-unquote mind. Okay, according to Freud, we're going to go through each stage. We're going to start with the oral stage. Back over to me, though. Very importantly, Freud believed that the development of the psyche, or personality, that's what he called personality, was influenced by the way in which children expend libidinal energy. Is that making sense to you now? The way in which they expend the energy. And the most significant experiences that the child has in expending that energy as an infant are related to the body's sensitive, or what he called the erogenous zones. Because remember, why would he be looking at erogenous zones? Because he's dealing with sex as being one of the primary instincts. Is everybody following that? Okay, and in his theory, those erogenous zones change over the course of a child's development. And what's going on? They're expending libidinal energy. Folks, this is hard to understand because it's all of this unconscious processes and things like libidinal energy that's very hard to define what it is. And that's certainly one of the problems with Freudian theory, is that you can't prove it. So when we talk about expending libidinal energy at different parts of the body, we start first with the mouth, then the anus, and then the genitals. And that's how his theory runs. Essentially, what Freud is saying is that at different stages, the child experiences this libidinal pleasure in a very sensuous way, because he's talking about sexual energy. And not only is the child expending libidinal energy on different erogenous zones, here's the key to the theory, is that the child's relationships with other people are heavily influenced by what? The way they pay attention to or don't pay attention to the child's attention at that zone at that time. So again, it's not just what's going on in the mind of the child, but also the way in which relationships are forged and what happens with those relationships, depending on how well people in the environment are able to take care of that child's needs. And therefore, the crux of Freud's theory is that personal and social relationships throughout life, not just in infancy, throughout life, in other words, what he's talking about, the way you feel about yourself, the way that you feel about other people, the way you treat other people, the way you treat yourself, according to him, were founded in very early experiences of life, based on this child's need to expend the libidinal energy and the kind of response that they get from the environment. Very importantly, remember Freud was trying to explain initially psychopathology, right? Let's go back to his original aim. He wanted to find this mind-body connection to find out why these women that he was seeing were having these hysterical conversions, which is what he eventually called them. Hysterical because they came from the mind, conversions because they were physical symptoms that were generated from the mind rather than the body. So what he was really out to solve is how do people become pathological? How do they gain these psychiatric illnesses and have symptoms? And he has it all stemming back to where? The needs of the libido as an infant. And what he said, many of the patients that he worked with, by the way, as a psychoanalyst, they didn't have this hysterical conversion or the physiological symptoms, but rather they had what were then called neuroses, behavior patterns that were seen as being somehow out of the ordinary. So what he was trying to find out, and what he was theorizing about, is how the infant's early experience with others in their environment can then lead to these massive repressions and then affect relationships throughout life. Not just relationships with other people, but relationships of the child with himself or herself. The way they see themselves, the way they see other people, the way they interact with other people. And he's tying it all back to early childhood development. Any questions about that? I'm not going to ask, is this real, is it accurate or not, because that's a different question. I just want you to understand the thinking that goes behind this. Okay, in Freudian theory, there are 5 stages. We started with the oral stage, roughly, and these are just rough time frames, roughly birth through 1 year old. Freud dealt with what he called the first trauma, the very first trauma that babies experience. Does anybody know what that is? Birth. The birth trauma. According to Freud, here the infant comes from a secure womb, right? Where there is nothing traumatic supposedly going on. Once a child is born, the child is overwhelmed with all of these stimuli from the external environment. And the reaction, according to Freud, is really intense fear. Why is it intense fear? Because the child has no ego to deal with the external world. You all following this? Again, in Freud's formulation, the child is born with id impulses and nothing else, and no way to mediate reality. According to Freud, and there are many therapies, there are therapies that actually evolved from this, that birth is the first trauma the child experiences, and it is then the prototype for all subsequent traumas. Okay, so let's turn to the oral stage. Let's get to the heart of the rationality behind this. or the heart of the thinking. I'm not so sure it's rational. The heart of the thinking about it. Can you tell that I'm not a big adherent of Freud's? But I think it's important that we know exactly what he said. I think it's really critical that we know what his theory was about so that we know what its strengths and weaknesses are. And he got some things right, but he got most things wrong. What happens roughly from birth through 1, where is the child receiving pleasure?
The mother.
Orally, through the mouth. Because what is the child's erotic zone or erogenous zone is the mouth when the child gets hungry and needs to feed. And then we did not have baby formula back then, so when children fed, we were talking about mom's breast. Okay, here's where it gets a little bit complex, but it's real critical to understand this. The id seeks to invest libidinal energy, remember what that is, the sexual energy, on images that are going to bring it satisfaction. In this case, the image is what? Mom's breast, right? I'm sure that in some of your internships and your placements, you're going to hear some of these terms. They're not used as much anymore. But the act of investing libidinal energy into the object that brings you pleasure is what he called cathexis. Cathexis. When the id channels the energy onto the image, not the object itself, is everybody clear about the image of the object, it is cathecting that object. Investing all the energy, not necessarily on the object, but the image that the child has. Do you remember we talked about primary process, what happens? The child builds up images of the objects that are going to give them pleasure. Okay, following birth, the initial object of cathexis obviously is mom's breast. Or, today, a suitable substitute such as the nipple on a bottle. What is going on with the child, according to Freud, is that the oral zone, the mouth, is used to satisfy the needs as the child starts to investigate the world around him or her. And how are they doing it? By cathecting on the images that give them pleasure and satisfying their needs. Very importantly, as children start to grow, they start to distinguish between me and not me. Me and not me. Very, very young infants, according to this formulation, do not know the difference between self and other. They cannot self-other differentiate. Again, this becomes a very important point for not just Freud, but all of the reformulators after him. Initially, according to Freud, the child begins to distinguish me from not me by regarding pleasure-giving objects as a self, initially. Things that do not give pleasure are the non-self. In the oral stage, there are 2 stages, the receptive, sucking, and then we have a more active stage, which you call the biting stage. And what, in the real world, what do we see infants doing? They suck and they bite, right? Yes or no? Yes. So some of this really is based on reality. It's what he says is going on in the brain of the child, well, not the brain, but the mind, that we need to pay attention to. Very importantly, what Freud was saying is that if during, for example, this receptive stage of sucking, swallowing, mouthing the breast, if the child's needs are not met, here's where the pathology comes in. The unfulfillment of these needs is expressed later in their adult personality. So therefore, that's where we get, according to Freud, some people who have neurotic overdependency. Do you see how this kind of makes sense internally? That if I am sucking and I'm dependent and I'm not getting my needs met, what's going to happen as an adult? I'm going to express those same kind of frustrations as an adult because I did not get enough of something as an infant. In the biting stage, here's the infant getting a little bit more mature where they actually have teeth and can bite. In the biting stage, the child recognizes the features of the outside objects more clearly. And now the child is able to differentiate me from not me. And the child starts to realize that mom, who is not me, can be both an object of pleasure and pain. Because when mom is not meeting my needs, I feel pain. When mom is meeting my needs, I feel pleasure. Well, mom can't be there all the time. Mom can't be there all the time, and therefore sometimes mom is there giving pleasure in the form of food and satisfying the oral urges. And other times, the reality is mom is not there. Mom is not going to feed the baby 24/7 or every time he or she cries. Again, crux of the theory. Based on this early stage, the infant develops ambivalent feelings about mom. Ambivalent feelings. In other words, love-hate. When mom is giving pleasure, the infant loves mom. What happens when mom is not giving pleasure? Come on, folks. Hate. Okay, according to Freud, early ambivalent feelings are expressed through biting. Again, does this make sense internally? Not does it make sense in the real world. Does it make sense internally? I hope so. Okay, and what do infants tend to bite? Mom's breasts, people's fingers, toys, etc., etc. According to Freud, this is not just the child biting to experiment with biting. What they're expressing is their frustration. Frustration of the needs not getting met. Now let's take a look at the pathology he attributes to this. If the child does not complete progress through the stage, if their needs are not adequately met, they become fixated or stuck at this stage, and this shows itself in adult patterns of behavior. I love this. People who have biting personalities, people who chew each other out. Folks, this is Freudian theory. It sounds comical, and in fact, there are comedians who have done skits on this. Franken and Davis, Al Franken, who is now was a comedian, he's now a comedian, writer, and politician. He and his partner Davis had a very funny skit on Freudian stages of development. Very importantly, in Freudian theory, children can become fixated at any stage. Fixated means they cannot get past that stage. And therefore, what happens with adult personality? Any guesses? What does it show as adult personality?
Psychopathology.
It shows as some form of psychopathology or neurosis. Again, Freud was mostly concerned with neuroses. Now here's catch-22. When infants become fixated, children become fixated, it can be the result of either too much need satisfaction or too little need satisfaction. Think about the catch-22 for mom. How do you know when you're giving the child too little or too much? At each stage, the child progresses, according to Freud, if he or she gets enough pleasure to move along, but does not get too much satisfaction. Because if you get too much satisfaction, what's going to happen? You're going to get fixated. If you're totally satisfied at that stage, you're not going to want to move from that stage. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, more or less. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. So we move to Freud's next stage. For a second, which is the anal stage. What has happened now? The focus has moved from the mouth to the anus. Yes? Okay, back over to me. Essentially what he's talking about here is potty training. As young infants do not have the ability to hold in their bowels. And yet, to live in a civilized society, you can't be in diapers all the time, right? You're laughing, but think about that. Yeah. In a civilized society, you cannot grow up and stay in diapers where you cannot hold your bodily functions. So the major task here is control of the bowels. However, it's not just a physiological task, it's also a psychological task, a psychosexual task. Rather than food, the major concern, now obviously the child still needs food, but those needs supposedly have been met more or less. If it's less, the child has pathology. If it's more, the child has pathology. It has to be just right. So we've moved now here to the child learning how to hold in the bowels and also let out when it's necessary. Very importantly, during this stage, the child is having a lot of contact. How old are we talking about now? Roughly 2 years old in our society. At least that's when we decide. And you've got to think about this. The reason that we have decided that 2 years old is when we have to potty train has more to do with the nature of society. Think about parents who want to bring their 2-year-old to somebody's swimming pool. Now, let's look at this realistically. If you look at other cultures, there's nothing magic about the age of 2 that says children have to be potty trained at 2. But in this society, with the kind of expectations that we have, and certainly at Freud's time, he said, this is the quote-unquote normal time that this happens.
Daycare don't want to take kids with diapers either. So
yeah, in today's society, a lot of kids are in daycare, and a lot of daycare places don't want kids in diapers. So very importantly, what he says is that it's not just about learning how to hold the bowels, but it's also how you develop relationships with people while you're doing that. He's got 2 sub-stages. Very importantly, at this stage, he says, this is a very hard stage. Again, this is the theoretical part. And he says, if the child is to accomplish bowel and bladder control, the ego has to resist the id's urges. Because what is the id's urge? Let it out. Right? The id has no reason to hold it in. But now we have an ego in a 2-year-old child that's growing that says, no, sometimes you've got to hold it in. Sometimes you've got to hold it in. And therefore, the libidinal force that's necessary, he called countercathexis at this stage. Folks, this is not going to be on the exam. I want you to understand the rationale behind this theory. In other words, the id just wants pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And for an infant, what is it pleasurable to do? Is to let it out. And it takes a lot of training for the child to learn when to hold it in and when to let it go. And therefore, in the Freudian model, the child had to develop something called countercathexis. Because what is the child cathected on? They have the images of things that give them pleasure. And what gives them pleasure? Letting it out. Therefore, to not let it out, the id has to borrow energy from the ego to learn how to hold it in. Is this becoming as clear as mud? Okay, very importantly, cathexis, letting it out, is pleasurable, holding it in is not. And therefore, it's got to be handled responsibly by the adults in the child's life. If it's not handled responsibly, the child is going to repress the conflict, and the child will become possibly compulsively clean, prissy in social situations and interactions, frequent use of cursing. That's in the early stages. In the later stages, when the child learns how to hold it in, the child can start hoarding things. The adult can start hoarding things. You'll see how these pathologies relate deliberately and directly to the developmental task that Freud said was going on. Okay, next stage is the phallic stage. Back to the PowerPoint for just a minute. The phallic stage. This is probably one of the most important stages in Freud's theory. And I'm going to talk you through this. Roughly, where do we get the phallic stage? What age?
3 to 5.
Roughly 3 to 5 years old. So by the end of the phallic stage, what is starting to develop? The superego. You all following this? Okay, this is really the heart and soul of Freudian theory. Well, all of it is the heart and soul, but this is a very important stage. Now the erogenous zone has moved from the mouth, from the anus to where? To the genitals. And here he's talking about real sexual pleasure in his mind. So the child, and do children fondle their sex parts? All the time. They don't know any better. They don't know that it's not allowed until they have incorporated the superego, right? According to Freud, what the child does is the child tends to associate the fondling of the genitals with the object of pleasure, who in this point is what? Mom, right? Well, think about the reality. Who is taking care of the baby's needs primarily? It's mom. Let's start with this. Freud said that humans are inherently bisexual. Let's start with that. He did not think that sexual orientation was something that was part of what we inherit with the id. He said we could go either way. What it keeps us from being homosexual or continue to be bisexual is what? The socialization of society that says heterosexuality is the norm. So therefore, this leaves it open during the phallic stage, the cathexis for mom now takes on genital properties. You all following that? The cathexis for mom, initially it was the mouth and mom's breast. Now it takes on genital qualities. So little boys masturbate, and what do they feel? They feel pleasure. That's the id saying, gimme, 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 right? The child then, according to Freud, pairs this pleasure with who? With mom. Not just mom, but the image of mom. Is everybody clear about that? That primary process is the images. And according to Freud, what starts to develop is an Oedipal complex, in that dad becomes a rival for mom's attention and affection. However, since the child is bisexual, he also, if it's a boy child, acts like a little girl and has affection for dad and jealousy for mom. So you develop this ambivalent feelings towards both sets of parents. And these double set of attitudes become what he called the Oedipus complex. As the child grows older, they learn the sex differences. And, crux of Freud's theory, that boys come to conclude that girls once had a penis and that it was taken away from them as punishment. You're laughing. You're laughing. Why are you laughing? Because it doesn't reflect the real world, right?
Oh, yeah.
It doesn't reflect the real world. He called this castration anxiety. Castration anxiety. And therefore, the boy becomes afraid of several things: losing dad's love and affection, and also of losing his penis. Very importantly, here's where the superego starts to come in. At the end of this stage, what's happening? The child then has to identify with dad, the boy has to identify dad, and develop what he calls a reaction formation to alleviate the negative feelings about dad. Because so far, the child is feeling very conflictual about both mom and dad, right? Now, what happens to this process? It can't stay in the conscious mind. It becomes, everybody, repressed. Okay. Girls, however, Freud saw as being inferior. Why did he see them as being inferior? Because they do not have castration complex. They know from the beginning that they never had one of those, right? However, girls also first cathect on mom. Girls as well are also bisexual and develop two sets of attitudes towards mom and dad. However, in Freudian theory, when the girl discovers she has no penis, she starts to feel inferior. Because what's the reality? Little boys and girls play doctor at this stage, yes? You show me yours and I'll show you mine. Very commonly, according to Freud, because unlike boys who have castration complex, which, by the way, castration complex in his theory forces the development of the superego, forces the better development of the ego. You all following this? Mm-hmm. They have to get over that castration complex, and therefore their ego becomes more and more healthy, and they become more individuated. Girls, however, don't have a castration complex, and when they discover they have no penis, they start to feel inferior. Does this sound like the real world, folks? No, but it's the real world of Freudian theory. And what happens is that this can lead to masculine behavior or sexual inhibition as an adult. More commonly, girls come to resent their mom who have the same exact deficits that they do. And therefore, it intensifies their attachment to their dad. And they start to see mom as their rival. I love this part. According to Freud, the way that girls compensate for this need is that they have an unconscious wish to have dad's baby. Remember, this is a very sexually based theory. Very importantly, according to Freud, because girls do not have a superego, do not have the anxiety that cause them to have a stronger superego, girls inherently, because of their biology, have a weaker superego. So they are never quite the same whole people. And therefore, according to Freud, women, girls, have a problem in sublimating, that's turning their nasty impulses into positive actions, and they stay narcissistically vain and bitter about their genitals. Thus, according to him, women become more neurotic. Do you start to understand his logic, not logic, his logic in this? Okay, what I'd like you to do is a couple of cartoons that my friend Jim Daniel drew for me. Some of these are fairly famous cartoons, but he drew his own version of them. Can you focus in on this? Okay, can you all read that? Yeah. This one says, Mommy said that you got one of those, but we got the brains. Here's another cute version of it. Nope, never had one. Why do you ask? And this is probably the most famous one. So that explains our differences in pay. Ah, how about that? Everybody following the logic of this theory so far? Okay, so do you understand how important this stage, the phallic stage and the Oedipal complex are, not just informing how people feel about themselves in Freudian theory, but how they develop relationships with others. And again, that's why he saw women as being so inferior, because he saw them as being very narcissistic. Because they did not have a penis and therefore felt inferior due to that. Okay, let's go to the next stage, which he called, back to the PowerPoint for a minute, the latency stage. So let's take a look at what's going on here. Back over to me. The dominant zone at the latency stage, roughly ages 4 or 5 through puberty. It's a very big stage, right? Time-wise. The dominant zone of gratification is still the genitals. However, it is not displayed in behavior. Because what's happening? The child is busy repressing all of those sexual urges towards mom and dad. You're following this? They're trying to resolve this Oedipal complex that arose at the last stage. And what Freud says is that what sometimes arises here, or what always arises, this repression leads to what he called infantile amnesia. Anybody know what infantile amnesia is? It is something that is real, by the way. It's a real phenomenon. Why it happens is probably different than what Freud said. As we get older, we tend to lose most of our memories of childhood. Again, as we get older, we tend to lose most of our memories of childhood. Children, we'll talk about this later on in the course, children actually have very good memories. Children tend to be able to tell you what they've done. They might not have the vocabulary to tell you everything, but children have very good memories for things that they've done and seen. However, one of the things that does happen as we get older is that we tend to lose most of our childhood memories. We do not have memories from when we were infants. And why is that? We do not have memories, a lot of very concrete memories about most of our childhood. Why is that? According to Freud, it's because we are so busy having to deal with the Oedipal complex. And therefore, because we know that we're not supposed to have sexual urges towards mom and dad, that we have to repress all of these urges, and that's what causes the infantile amnesia in Freudian theory. Now, is infantile amnesia a real phenomenon? The answer is absolutely yes, but probably not. I think I could safely say probably not for the reasons that he said. So what do we see children doing at this stage? Folks, typically, what do children 4 or 5 do? They play with same-sex friends. You talk to a boy about maybe you're going to have a girlfriend someday. Oh, no, yuck, right? They're not interested in the opposite sex. They're playing with same-sex friends. And what's happening, according to Freud, is that the superego is gaining strength. What they're doing by playing with same-sex friends is that they're trying to control, in Freudian theory, their sexual thoughts towards mom and dad. Very importantly, playing by the rules here is very, very important. And now we have a fully developed or developing superego. And what happens is that children play games, they play activities, and it's very important in terms of conformity. What children are learning during this stage is how to conform not just to mommy and daddy's rules, but to the larger rules of society. Not surprisingly, if children get fixated here, they have problems later on with sexual relationships with the opposite sex. Or they might perform sexual activities in a very aggressive manner if they become fixated. Remember, fixated means getting stuck at a stage. Why do children get stuck? Because they get too much or too little need satisfaction. Finally, Freud's final stage, so the PowerPoint for just a second, which he called the genital stage. Okay, back over to me. This is what he called the mature genital period. Remember, from the third stage on, everything is still concentrated in the genitals. The phallic stage is the genitals, the latency stage in the is the genitals, and this is the mature genital stage. What is going on with teenagers roughly during puberty? That's where the stage begins, roughly puberty through adulthood. What is going on biologically with children?
Physical changes.
Massive physical changes, massive hormonal changes, right? So we see the physiological changes that are associated with puberty, and not surprisingly, children at this stage turn their attention to the opposite sex, whether we want them to or not. Clearly, girls do this more quickly than boys because girls simply mature socially quicker than boys do, but luckily for us, boys do catch up. Most of them do. What happens at this stage, according to Freud, the mature response to this is copulation. Yes? However, here we are with children of 14 and 15 and 16, and what's happening to those urges to copulate? They're getting frustrated by the society that says, no, you're too young, right? So society erects barriers to them getting those needs fulfilled. In this final stage, according to Freud, society's rules make adolescents sublimate as a defense mechanism. By sublimating, you repress the id urges, and what comes out in your behavior is pro-social activities. In other words, what are you doing with those sexual urges? You're repressing them back down to the deep unconscious. You all following that? And what has to happen is they've got to stay repressed until you're old enough to have sex, right? Or until you're old enough for society to say that you can have sex, in marriage, of course. And what happens is that, and typically what do you see children doing at this age? They get involved in scouting, they get involved in peer groups, right? They get involved in lots of pro-social kinds of things, and they're in school. They become involved in artistic activities, philanthropic activities, and those are good coping mechanisms for this stage. Very importantly for Freud, as the child turns the attention away from same-sex friends toward other sex, in other words, in early adulthood, when you're now old enough to get married and have sex, this is when the Oedipal complex becomes resolved. Is this making sense to you? Not in the real world, but making sense to you in terms of better understanding Freudian theory? Any questions about that? Because I want to move on and talk about some of the Freudian reformulators and talk about the current controversy. No questions? This is surprising. Okay, let's go back to the PowerPoint. As I said, we're not going to be able to cover everybody in the lectures, but you do have all of the reformulators. You have most of the reformulators and people who have changed these theories. I want to just point out really quickly two theorists who are feminists who really revised Freudian thought. And I'm not going to have time to get into a lot of their theory, but I want to show you what feminist reformulations of Freud look like. Karen Horney, psychoanalyst, said penis envy, if it exists because not the girls are jealous of boys' penises, but they're jealous of the status that is associated with having a penis. Because, she said, well, let's look at the reality. Society values men more than women. They did in her time period, and do they still? Yeah. Yes, unfortunately. Not to the same extent, but certainly. What she also said, she came up with her own reformulation that she called womb envy. And she said, if women are envious of men's penises, it's because of the status. But she said, men who are really driven to be successful do so because they don't have the ability to procreate. And therefore, they are envious of the fact that women can. That's turning it on its head, yes? Well, that's important because Freud thought that women were inferior. Freud thought that women, first of all, he said openly that he didn't understand women, but he thought that they were inferior. She also came up, her work is fascinating, by the way. She came up with her own theory of neuroses, in which she had 10 different patterns of neurotic needs that had to do with how people relate to each other. She very strongly emphasized cultural and social differences. She came up with the theory of the real self and the ideal self, but again, this is a reformulation of Freud, so it is still very Freudian-based, and it's still based on trying to explain how people become neurotic. However, unlike Freud's negative or pessimistic view of people, particularly of women, she really shared Abraham Maslow's view that people really strive for self-actualization, some higher sense of self. Another one of the reformulators, more recently, more currently, is Nancy Chodorow. And Nancy Chodorow was very interesting, both a psychoanalyst and a sociologist. Both a psychoanalyst and a sociologist. And she was really interested in her work in the psychological reasons that women desire motherhood. Clearly, we know that there are biological reasons, yes? But she was interested more in the psychological reasons. So in her attempts to explain that, she came up with her own theory that says, again, this is turning Freud around entirely, because Freud said that women's development was problematic and conflictual, yes? Why was it conflictual? Because they never got the castration complex, because they didn't have a penis. And therefore, women develop not as well-developed superegos. She turned Freudian theory on its head and said, wait a minute, it's not female development that's conflictual, it's male development. And female development is fine and important in order to have women want to procreate. Everyone following this? Not just biologically, but why psychologically women would want to. And folks, let's put this in context. Procreation is very necessary for perpetuation of the species. So essentially what she was asking, and this is much of this theory, not hers, but much theory was written before we had birth control. Now we can control the timing in which we have children. Before, procreation was just naturally a part of life. We didn't have effective birth control. We had condoms, but people sometimes used them, sometimes didn't, sometimes they broke. Procreation was a very important part of life, so therefore she was trying to explain what were the psychological phenomenon that went into women wanting to procreate. Back to the PowerPoint. And here's her reformulation. She said that infants experience a primary oneness with mother. Let's think about that. Infants cannot self-other differentiate, right? She's right with Freud on that. She's right there with Freud and says they can't self-differentiate, and therefore what they experience is being one with their mom. As they begin to differentiate self from other, she says girls and boys have different experiences. Girls experience femaleness. They are very much like mom. They develop a strong bond to mom because they are female and mom's a female. And guess what moms do in return? Develop a strong bond to the female child because the female child is more like her than not like her. Boys, however, as they start to individuate and differentiate, know that they're not like mom. And therefore, they experience something called being not female. Therefore, boys have a much more conflictual and harder time in her formulation because rather than becoming closer to mom and identifying with mom, they must form looser attachments. And in her formulation, this is exactly how come women, in their strong attachments to mom, want to be more like mom and therefore want to procreate on a psychological level, not just a biological level. Does that make sense? Do you see how we can take these same concepts that we can't measure and just turn them upside down? Okay, in the last part of the class, I want to talk about the most current controversy, and that has to do with, the other thing that Chodorow said, by the way, is that acceptance of the domestic ideal of women having children is truly the foundation of women's oppression. Because if you take a look back to what we expect women to do and what men to do, we give women very narrowly constricted roles of being wives and mothers. And that, according to Chodorow, is what leads to their oppression. So she really was looking at the bigger picture as well. Okay, here's what I call Freud is dead, or is he? Or is he? I have an article up on WebCT with a link. I put the actual article up there and a link, and I'll talk a little bit about this work. Freudian theory had just about died out by the 1970s and 80s. You can come back over to me. Freudian theory had just about died out by the 70s and 80s, and all of a sudden Freudian theory became revived with the work of Jeffrey Masson and Alice Miller. The article that I put up there is an article about Jeffrey Masson's controversy about the seduction theory. Let me talk about the seduction theory. In some of his early writings, Freud believed that children were actually being abused, sexually abused, by their parents, by adults. And what's this abuse? Because it gets repressed. Remember, all traumas get repressed in Freudian theory. What happens to them as adults? Come on, folks. You have to use the...
They develop neuroses.
They develop neuroses or other kinds of pathologies, right? So he was seeing clients that would come to him, and he was convinced that the root of their problems was something clearly that happened in childhood. And they said they had no memory of being sexually abused. And he used all kinds of methods, including hypnosis and other kinds of relaxation techniques to get people to think about their abuse. And sure enough, when pressed and pressured, literally pressured, these women would eventually come up with details of abuse. So that was his first hypothesis. The women were truly being abused. The children, not just women, but preponderance women. Later on, he changed his theory, and he came to say that they are not experiencing real abuse, they are experiencing fantasies. In other words, they are fantasizing about being abused about having sex with their parents. This is very consistent with his theory, right? Mm-hmm. Fantasizing about having sex with parents. If you take a look at his original works, and some people have pointed to this, fantasy, as he wrote it, was P-H-A-N-T-A-S-I-E, and he was talking about an unconscious process. Somehow that became known as a conscious process, fantasizing. Masson then came along and said, okay, wait a minute. Let's look at his early work, and Masson decided, and I really want you to read this, you cannot understand Freud without understanding the context of his medical practice, of his psychoanalytic practice. He was also doing a lot of surgery on people, and I've given you that article to read. And a lot of what we know about Freud is not only in his writings, but also in letters, correspondence he had with other analysts. And it's a fascinating read about his seduction theory. Masson came along. He was in charge of the Freud archives at the time, and he came along and he took a look at all of Freud's writing, and he said, wait a minute, Freud gave up his seduction theory, in other words, that children were really being abused, because of pressure from his peers. That was Masson's take on it. And right about this time, let's think about this. We did not have laws against child abuse or child sexual abuse until the 1970s. We didn't talk about child sexual abuse. So in the name of feminism, what was revived here, in the name of feminism, by Masson and other feminist scholars, they were saying, wait a minute, let's take a look. Freud was right the first time. Freud was right the first time when he said that children are truly being molested by their parents. And therefore, we came up with these theories of repressed memory, right back to Freudian repression. What we developed then was a culture in which therapists were being taught that the root of all evil, the root of all of women's problems, some men too, but primarily women, is that they have repressed memories of childhood sexual abuse. Even they couldn't tell you about it, they don't remember it, the same way that Freud's early clients couldn't tell him about it, couldn't give him details, but when given enough therapy, they came up with it. And what evolved, essentially, was a whole culture in which women would go to therapy with what I would call relatively mundane problems and come out believing in sexual abuse that never occurred, or most likely never occurred. Women who had been abused were told by their therapists, the abuse you remember is not important, it's the abuse you don't remember that's keeping you sick. So back to the next slide. And we can talk more about this. There were several different kinds of traumas that have come to be written about to help understand massive repression. Because the question comes up, how can people massively repress things? How can you be abused for years and years and years and not remember that? And some of these theories came up with explanations for that. The current scientific consensus, and I'm going to leave this on the PowerPoint, which is going to be on WebCT, after 50 years of research, 120 studies, more than 14,000 people with documented experiences of trauma, there is no evidence of repressed memory. Does that surprise you? It doesn't. Most people would say, of course it surprises me because we believe so strongly in repression. What we have found through research, and this is why I call it scientific consensus, is that the most common ways that people forget is normal forgetting mechanisms, sometimes infantile amnesia, we simply can't remember things that have happened to us, intoxication, or brain injury. In a recent court brief, a statement was made that decades of research and scientific debate have clarified over and over that the notion of traumatic events being somehow repressed and later accurately, do you understand, accurately recovered, is one of the most pernicious bits of folklore to ever infect psychology and psychiatry. With that said, we do have a consensus. The professional consensus, by the way, is very conflictual because there is a small group of people who believe in repression and a larger group of people who now say this is absolutely bogus. Here's what we do know about child sexual abuse. It is harmful and prevalent. So we're not denying that child abuse does occur. Again, child sexual abuse is very harmful and very prevalent. Satanic ritual abuse is rare. Most people who were abused remember all or part of what happened. And adults with continuous memories are more likely to have accurate memories. Finally, although it is rare, some traumas can be forgotten and later remembered. You do not have to repress it to have that. Memories from infancy are highly unreliable. And finally, false or pseudo memories can be created. And we can talk more about this. Okay, any questions? We have 1 minute and 24 seconds left. Okay, we will handle questions in the second part of class. Thank you all.